Now that we've had a chance to dig right into Chapter 12 and learn about the central nervous system, let's take a look at Chapter 13, the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system includes the sensory receptors and the afferent pathways, of bringing information to the central nervous system from the rest of the body. The nerves in which the axons of those sensory receptors lie, and the ganglia in which they synapse, and also the efferent pathways and motor endings that carry information out to the rest of the body from the central nervous system. And here's a little schematic diagram of the nervous system we looked at once before. So we've looked at the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. Now we're going to be looking at the sensory divisions of the peripheral nervous system and motor divisions. Now we've already spent time looking at the somatic division of the motor systems in Chapter 9. And in Chapter 14 we'll look at the autonomic divisions, motor divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So let's start out by looking at the sensory receptors. What kind of specialized dendrites are present that allow us to perceive the nature of various stimuli in our environments and so forth. Sensation is what's provided to us by these sensory afferents. Awareness of what the stimuli are, as I said, perception of the stimuli. We'll classify all the different types of receptors based on, first of all, the type of stimulus they detect. Secondly, in terms of location of the stimulus that they are detecting. And third, according to structure. Now when it comes to structure, that's where we'll spend most of our time. We'll look at a bunch of specific types of simple nerve endings, or simple receptors. Complex receptors are the special senses that we'll talk about in Chapter 15. So we'll look at non-encapsulated and encapsulated simple receptors. These are the categories of stimuli, or receptors for stimuli, according to the type of stimulus. Mechanoreceptors are dendrites of neurons, sensory neurons, that respond to pressure, touch, vibration, and stretch. As mechanically, if you bend the membrane, it depolarizes, or if you make it vibrate, it depolarizes, and so forth. Thermoreceptors, there's a couple of populations of sensory neurons that either detect decreases in temperature or increases in temperature in the skin and deep in the organs to alert the hypothalamus about what's happening so it can make the appropriate adjustments to maintain body temperature. Photoreceptors, well again we'll talk about those in Chapter 15, respond to light energy. We shouldn't leave out then the type of receptors in the cochlea, which are actually a type of mechanoreceptor. Chemoreceptors, a lot of different important chemoreceptors in your body that allow you to appreciate your sense of smell and taste, that allow your hypothalamus to know the level of metabolic activity in your muscles, and allow your body to know about the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood, the amount of oxygen in your blood, the pH of the blood. So a lot of different important chemoreceptors that will come up in subsequent chapters. Nociceptors might be the least familiar, or at least the least decipherable just by their name. They're pain receptors. So there's a population of neurons that specifically report and create the sensation of pain. They're often activated by tissue injury, for example, or trauma. But it's interesting to note that virtually any sensory receptor, when overloaded, when faced with a stimulus that exceeds its normal range of activity, will produce a pain sensation. Classification by location of stimulus. Exteroceptors sense stimuli that come from outside your body, so they're found in the skin and skeletal muscles near the surface of your body. Interoceptors respond to internal stimuli, so they're found in all your organs and so forth. Generally speaking, interoceptors are visceroceptors, meaning they're not somatic. We don't have conscious awareness of their reporting. However, if there's a very large stimulus of some sort taking place inside the body, a somatic sensation will be perceived, even though the actual sensory neuron is not a somatic sensory neuron. Proprioceptors are those that are found in the skeletal muscles, the joints, and the tendons. They respond to they report to the cerebellum the nature of the activity of the musculoskeletal system so that it can help with fine-tuning motor plans that are developed in your premotor cortex to allow you to achieve your goals in terms of moving your body. As we go through the specific types of sensory receptors, please note in each case whether that receptor is adapting or non-adapting. Adaptation means that certain types of sensory receptors, in the presence of a constant stimulus, reduce or stop their frequency of action potentials. So normally when a sensory receptor reaches threshold, it sends action potential or a series of them to the central nervous system. Some sensory receptors stop doing that. They don't continue to report. Phasic receptors, they're called. So in other words, we don't need to be alerted to every single sensory stimulus on the surface of our body, for example, our clothes touching our body, every second of the day. And so some of these touch receptors, for example, will adapt, stop reporting until a change happens. It's always about changes for them. Initiation of a stimulus or discontinuation of a stimulus will cause a burst of reporting of action potentials. Tonic receptors are ones that are non-adapting. Pain receptors are non-adapting, for example. There's mechanisms, as we'll see, in which the central nervous system can block some of the signals coming from nociceptors so that we don't have to appreciate every last bit of the magnitude of pain that we were experiencing after an injury. But it's not because the nociceptors are adapting. Proprioceptors are non-adapting because the cerebellum needs to know about the musculoskeletal system all the time so that the moment we decide to develop a motor plan, it's ready with the information we need to assist with that. Okay, what kind of simple receptors? Let's classify according to structure. We'll first look at non-encapsulated simple receptors and then encapsulated. Non-encapsulated simple receptors include free nerve endings. Dendrites of sensory neurons just sticking out into connective tissue, into epithelia, and they are typically thermoreceptors that detect changes in temperature, either decreasing temperature or increasing temperature depending on the neuron. Pain receptors, nociceptors, which are sensitive to, say, chemicals coming from within cells. If cells are torn open because of tissue trauma, then ATP and various intracellular substances will cause activation of nociceptors. Temperature extremes, mechanical extremes, pinching will cause opening of ion channels, depolarization, and action potentials. Stretch receptors in the tissues are often free nerve endings, say in the dermis and the epidermis. Itch receptors, interesting, a relatively recently discovered category or type of sensory neuron that provides that sensation of itchiness. Modified free nerve endings refers to the Merkel cells, the Merkel discs. A little problem with my order of my animation here. Merkel cells, you may remember, are in the basal layer of the epidermis, and they, in conjunction with some modified dendrites of neurons in the papillary dermis, provide sensitive touch reception. Hair follicles have essentially free nerve endings wrapped around the hair follicle bulbs, which provide very sensitive reporting about anything that touches a hair, which then will jiggle that hair follicle deep down in the dermis and make us aware of it. Here's a little cartoon. Visuals are great for remembering things, and here we see free nerve endings, temperature receptors, nociceptors, stretch receptors, and itch receptors, perhaps in connective tissue and in epithelia. Merkel cells in the basal layer of the epidermis, in conjunction with some sort of modified dendrite of a unipolar sensory neuron, and a hair follicle receptor. Deep down in the dermis, here we see that purple is the basal layer of the epidermis, and here we are in the papillary dermis, and then down in the reticular dermis. The encapsulated receptors now, let's take a look at. There are Meissner's corpuscles. They're also known as tactile corpuscles or tactile receptors. They're very discriminative light touch receptors, very sensitive touch receptors. they detect external stimuli, stereoceptors they are. They're fast adapting, and they're found in predominantly in hairless skin, such as on your palms and fingertips and soles of your feet and on your nipples and external genitalia. Pacinian corpuscles are collagen-ensconced dendrites that have layers and layers of collagen around them, that looks sort of like an onion if you cut through it. It's like a large ball of connective tissue covering. Exteroceptors and interoceptors are found in a number of different applications, but deep down in the dermis we may find them. Deep pressure and vibration, that's the most common location. That's what they sense, and they're also fast adapting receptors. Ruffini's endings are a type of collagen-encapsulated dendritic endings that are found in the deep dermis and hypodermis that sense continuous pressure. They're also found in joint capsules and other places. They are non-adapting. Right? They act as proprioceptors as well as deep pressure sensors in your dermis, and they are slow or non-adapting receptors. Right? If they play a role as proprioceptors, they can't be adapting. Two more types of proprioceptors: muscle spindles. We'll look at it a little bit later, close up and personal. Muscle spindles are receptors in the skeletal muscles that sense changes in muscle length. Golgi tendon organs are proprioceptors that detect muscle tension, in other words, stretching of tendons. In this table, originally this list of receptors includes a category called joint kinesthetic receptors. Kinesthesia refers to your ability to sense the position of parts of your body. So there's a number of different types of receptors that together, in your joint capsules and so forth, that together make you aware of the position of parts of your body. So this is not a type of actual physical receptor. It's a sort of more functional description of what some of the receptors may be doing, reporting to you about your body position. And here again, going back to some cartoon visuals. Meissner's corpuscles, you can see this sort of elaborate twist of dendritic ending wrapped around with some collagen fibers. It's a discriminative touch receptor, meaning it's usually packed in very densely in the tissues where it lies, and it's very sensitive, so that you have accurate knowledge of the position of the stimulus and a very sensitive nature of the stimulus. Very fast adapting type of receptor in hairless skin. Pacinian corpuscles, look at all the layers of connective tissue collagen fibers wrapped around this dendrite here, forming like a little ball, like an onion, and found deep in the dermis that senses deep pressure, stretch, and vibration. It's another rapidly adapting type of receptor, also found in tendons and ligaments, joint capsules, so it plays a role in some kinesthesia, even though it's a fast adapting receptor. Ruffini's endings are, again, a type of encapsulated receptor that is non-adapting, that's found in your joint capsules as well as your deep dermis and hypodermis, that senses deep stretch, but also joint position. And two proprioceptors I just mentioned, here are the intrafusal fibers, modified muscle cells that form the inner part of this particular type of receptor. This is just found right within a skeletal muscle. These reddish areas on the outside represent just the regular, long, cylindrical skeletal muscle cells that we've learned a lot about. And this is just a type of receptor ensconced in the muscle so that you can detect changes, either lengthening or shortening of muscles during activities of the skeleton. Golgi tendon organs are sensory receptors woven within tendons so that as the tendon stretches, these sensory fibers begin to report action potentials so that the tension on the tendons is known. Again, joint kinesthetic receptors represent a number of types of receptors that can make us aware of the position of our joints by their position in joint capsules. So our next section, join me for part 2 as we talk about sensory integration. We're going to talk about various stages of integration, putting together information from various aspects of the ascending pathways and the cerebral cortex that allow us to perceive or understand, make sense of the sensory stimuli that our bodies being impacted by.